Hi, and welcome to the Beer Temple. I am Chris Quinn, and this can only be described as a very special show. Very excited to do this show. Kind of was looking for the right time to do it and figured, you know, there's no time like the present, so I figured let's just get this bad boy on the show. It's the Sam Adams Utopias. It is a beer that I've never had before, and I'm going to go out and say it. This is the strongest beer in the world, the strongest fermented beer in the world. I don't care what those guys from Scotland say. This is the real deal. It is also one of the most expensive beers in the world, or in the country anyway, maybe the most expensive in the country. I think this beer retails, it has an MSRP. It doesn't even have an actual retail price. It MSRPs for about $150, but this vintage, 2011, I've seen for over $100 above that, so over $250. It's a very limited beer. And it's, well, let me go into it. So Sam Adams Utopias is the latest in a long line of extreme beers from Sam Adams. It started out in, I think, the early mid-90s with some of their Tripel box. If you guys remember that, they were like a corked bottle. I should have brought one on here. It was a corked bottle in like a cobalt blue colored bottle. Not really actually that great, but very strong. It was the strongest beer at the time. I think it was like 17% alcohol. Then Dogfish Head and them went back and forth for a while. Triple Bock was a barrel-aged beer, and they've kept this, you know, fairly limited barrel-aged program going at the Boston Beer Company to present time. And they've just over time learned how to make stronger and stronger beers, and it's ultimately culminated in Utopias. Like I said, this is a 27% alcohol beer. At that point, it's almost more like a spirit. The difference is spirits are distilled. So the best comparison would be whiskey, I would say, for not necessarily flavor-wise, but what this beer is. So, excuse me, whiskey is essentially distilled beer. You know, cognac is distilled wine. And what else? Rum is distilled sugar, fermented sugar beer, whatever you want to call it. So all these distilled spirits come from a base, you know, fermentation liquid. Whiskey is beer. This is not distilled. This is actually fermented. All the alcohol here was put right there in this quantity by the yeast. When you distill something, you're basically drawing out the water and concentrating the alcohol and some of the other flavors as well. That did not happen here. The reason that you can't just make very, very high alcohol, why not make 100% alcohol beer? Because the yeast die. I mean, they can only survive such a certain amount of alcohol. It's usually around like 10% or maybe up into the low teens, something like that. And then they start to die. They actually rupture. The alcohol ruptures their cell walls, and it gives off a very meaty flavor. It's called autolysis, and sometimes you might have heard me talk when I'm having often a very strong beer, usually a stout. I'll say, oh, there's some umami, there's some meaty flavors, which can be just from the normal fermentation process, but also there can be, you know, certain levels of, you know, this autolysis that's creating some meaty flavors in these beers. So it can quickly become undesirable and unpleasant tasting. So they had to really make sure that, you know, to keep the autolysis of the yeast down, to make sure that these yeast were incredibly hardy and could, you know, carry on such high fermentation alcohol percentages. And they barrel age them as well, and there are a lot of blending goes on into this Utopias. In fact, some of the original Triple Bock and, you know, subsequent years as well are actually in this Utopias. So there are beers that are, you know, well over 15, you know, you're talking about maybe 16, 17 or more years old, that's blended in here. A lot of it is in original or first use bourbon barrels. They also use cognac and port barrels, kind of like a finishing blend as well, like sometimes you get from whiskeys. And I've never had it before. You know, it's very unique. Jim Koch, the president of the Boston Beer Company, says this isn't just like any other beer in the world. This is like any other drink in the world. It's maybe more in common with a spirit flavor-wise, but it is a beer. The way they brew this beer is just with a massive amount of malt. Jim Koch estimated there was 1 pound or 2 pounds of malt per bottle. That's a lot. That's all you really need to know about that. That's a lot of malt. The malt creates the sugars. You need a lot of sugar to get this much alcohol because, as the mail comes, as you know, they chew up the sugars and they make alcohol. So without the sugar, they can't produce the alcohol. So strong beers need a lot of sugar. They ferment it for about 3 weeks, as opposed to like an average ale would maybe go 3 days. And I think it's just an incredibly vigorous and strong fermentation. The temperatures, the yeast as they ferment get hot, and with this much fermentation, the temperatures got so hot, Jim Koch was saying that it was actually evaporating the ethanol out, and they could see evaporated alcohol like on the brew kettle glass, just kind of condensing. Just absolutely bizarre. And then it's barrel aged and blended, and it's put out usually every other year. It is coming out in 2012 because I think it's their 10th year anniversary of Utopias. But this is the 2011 batch. Every bottle is numbered. This is bottle number, you know, whatever. Doesn't matter what bottle number is. And it's, well, I mean, let's try it. The other thing is, you know, it's in a bottle that, oh, I don't have a bottle opener. I'll be right back. I actually didn't think that this beer had a bottle. I thought it was either corked or just kind of a screw or something like that. What I was saying is this beer is so high in alcohol that also, much like a spirit, it's not going to go bad, at least not as quickly as a typical beer. This beer will last for months after opening. The shape, it's actually I think a porcelain bottle. Absolutely no hiss when this opens. Interesting. And oh, ooh, some pretty strong scents here. It's shaped like a brew kettle. I mean, just a really beautiful bottle here. I am going to be pouring it into a spirit glass that I have. I just think that's probably the most appropriate glass for it. That, or, you know, a snifter or something like that. I'll give myself a little more. There you go. And heavy sucker. Screw that back in. Yeah, so this beer will last for months now. So that's kind of cool. Maybe in a year or something like that, I'll come back and open the bottle again and see how it's tasting in a year. Let's look at this beer. First of all, I'll get to the aroma in a moment, but I mean, it has filled the room with an aroma. It is completely still. I've mentioned before that high alcohol beers, often it's hard to retain any sort of head or foam. Even this is to the extreme here. There is no carbonation. From what I'm told, at such high alcohol concentration, the alcohol actually pushes the CO2 out. So it can't go into solution. That's why you really don't see carbonated spirits, really. So it is a beautiful tawny red color. Reminds me almost of like a tawny port, or maybe a cognac, a little bit darker than most cognacs. Absolutely still, and it's very kind of looking almost like thin-bodied, like almost like a spirit would be. Remarkable. Wouldn't think this is a beer. Okay. You guys can listen to the wood chipper outside while I sniff. Okay, so, I mean, a lot of like rich dried fruit, cherry, a lot of barrel character as well, so you're getting a nice wood, earth character. A little bit of kind of a rosy floral quality from some of the fusel alcohols in here. I mean, you can't have a beer this strong without it having some of those fusels. And that last note, you know, I've been kind of putting my nose deep in, and I just set it on the edge here, and it almost tasted exactly like a tawny port. So kind of that lovely raisiny, some almost like oxidized quality to it. Ooh. Yeah, really nice tawny port character, and I'm liking that kind of raisin. I think raisin is a good way to go with also some cherry, wood, and there is a little bit of meatiness to it, like a savory quality. It's not like soy sauce or something like that, but there's definitely some there. But it's much easier to smell than obviously like a single malt would be, or a whiskey, or a bourbon or something like that. I'm just enjoying it so much just to smell it. Very interesting. A little bit of like yeah, that musty earthiness. Interesting. It tastes like, well, it doesn't, at first I was like, oh, it's like a spirit. And then I'm like, no, it's like a fortified wine. It's almost like a Madeira or a port. Maybe, you know, one of those Oloroso sherries, something like that. But it finishes like a whiskey almost. It's got that burn to it. And it also has qualities of none of those. It definitely has some beer-like malt caramel qualities as well. I'm taking tiny sips. I'm taking sips like I would take of a spirit. Really nice raisiny quality. There's a little bite of like a grape Robitussin thing going on as well, just a little bit. Kind of like that, like medicine-y, almost like bordering, not to eucalyptus, but you're starting to get into like a little bit of like a grape medicine. Probably not the most eloquent way to put that. You don't really get the alcohol until the end. The first taste is really nice and sweet, not cloyingly sweet, but very sweet, full, rich mouthfeel. Much more than I would think. I would think it'd be incredibly thin, but it's got a nice softness to it, considering the alcohol. And then you almost get like this, like kind of spritzy, like daggery feeling in your mouth, and you're like, oh, that's the alcohol. There's a lot of alcohol. And by that point, I usually swallow it, and then I just get that nice kind of slow burn, as I mentioned. Remarkable beer. You know, in a blind tasting of just what are you drinking right now, I wouldn't call this a beer any day of the week. I would probably go more towards like a fortified wine, like a sherry, or probably a tawny port. I'd be like, this is a really weird tawny port. Like this beer. How do I judge this beer? How do I rate it? I have no idea. It's so unique. It's so interesting. It's quite good. But you have to have it in tiny little sips. And it's quite an experience. I'm not going to factor the price into it. I'm just going to say, what am I tasting? Do I like it? It's going to be a pretty arbitrary number, guys, but it's going to be up there. It's in the 90s. I mean, I'll give it a 95. I mean, it's really good. It's incredibly complex. I just don't know there's nothing I've ever had to compare it to. I've had the, the Tactical Nuclear Penguin from the guys at Brewdog, which is really a distilled beer is how they get us. Most of their big beers are distilled, and that's how they get them. They're ice distilled. And that's a very good beer, but it's like, oh, wow, this is a really strong stout in the case of the Brewdog. This is like a caramel, whatever it is. It's Utopias. Interesting thing before I go, the name Utopias, the name Utopia, I guess, means a fanciful place, a place that does not exist, and that's why they named it that. They had in their mind a beer that did not exist, and they brought it and made it a reality. So I thought that was really cool, a cool way to come to the name. That's about it, guys. Thank you so much, guys. Lately we've had a lot of exposure on iTunes. A lot of people have been watching the show, and I am so happy for all the new viewers, but also for all the guys and girls who have been watching all this time. You guys know, the newbies may not know, but you guys know how appreciative I am of everything you guys do and all the wonderful things you say. So please keep it up. Love to get your emails and your comments. That's about it. Check us out on iTunes, obviously, and on my site, craftbeertemple.com, as well as on the Twitter sphere, Facebook sphere, whatever you want to call it. That's about it for now, guys. I'm going to go because I have got some incredibly unique and delicious beer to drink, and I hope that you do too.